I was working a temporary overnight maintenance job at a decommissioned relay station outside town, the kind of place nobody visited anymore but still needed someone to keep the lights on and the generators exercised. And most nights were exactly the same, quiet to the point of boredom, just me, a desk, a kettle, and the hum of equipment that had been installed decades before I was born. The radio on the desk unplugged because there was no reason to use it and no signal to reach anyway. And I remember thinking that the silence out there felt clean, like nothing could reach me through the dark fields and locked gates. And I settled into that feeling, made some notes, checked a panel, came back and sat down again. And that was when the radio turned on by itself. Not loudly, not suddenly, just a soft click and then static, low and steady, like it had been waiting. And I froze because I knew I hadn't touched it and there was no one else on site. I stood up slowly and watched it as if it might move again, but it didn't. It just whispered noise into the room. And after a few seconds, I told myself it was old wiring, residual power, something boring and technical. So I reached over and turned the knob to off, and the static died, and the silence came back, but it felt thinner, like it could tear if I moved too fast. I sat there longer than I meant to, listening to the building breathe, and when the radio turned on again, it did so at a slightly higher volume, enough that I could hear a rhythm in the static, a rise and fall that almost suggested pauses. And I didn't touch it this time. I just watched, because some part of me didn't want to confirm that it would respond if I did. And after a minute, the static shifted and a voice came through, faint, distorted, not saying words so much as trying to form them. And I remember leaning back in my chair because the voice sounded close, not like a broadcast, but like someone speaking into a microphone in the same room. And I told myself it was interference, that radios do that. They pick up fragments, echoes. But then the voice stopped and the static settled again. And I realized my name was written on the logbook in front of me and the radio was right beside it. And the idea that the two were connected settled in my chest in a way I didn't like. I stood up and walked the building, checked every locked door, every empty corridor, every dark corner where old equipment sat under tarps, and I was alone, completely, the way I had been all night. And when I came back, the radio was off, unplugged now because I had pulled the cord from the wall, and I felt a brief, childish relief until the speaker crackled again, still unplugged, still whispering static. And this time there was no voice, just a sound like breathing buried deep in the noise. Slow, patient, as if whatever was on the other end had learned it didn't need the radio to reach me. And I stayed there until morning without sitting down again, watching the door, watching the radio, waiting for something to explain itself. And when my replacement arrived and asked why I looked so tired, I told him it had been a long night, because there was no way to explain that even now, years later, I still don't turn on radios when I'm alone, and I never write my name where something might see it. I quit that job 2 days later without giving a reason, told myself it was just exhaustion, nerves, the kind of thing that happens when you sit alone too long listening to old buildings settle. And for a while that explanation worked. The radio stayed a memory, something uncomfortable but contained, until I started noticing how often silence followed me home, how rooms seemed to wait after I entered them, how I would catch myself listening for static where there was none. And the first time it happened again was months later in my apartment, a small place above a closed bakery, quiet at night except for traffic far away. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it, faint, almost polite, a hiss coming from the living room, and I stood there staring at my reflection, foam sliding down my chin, already knowing what I would see when I stepped out. The radio on my kitchen counter was old, something I'd bought secondhand years earlier and never used, and it was on, tuned to nothing, the same low breathing buried in static. And I unplugged it, didn't hesitate this time, but the sound didn't stop right away. It faded slowly, like someone stepping back from a microphone. And that was when I realized the radio wasn't the source, it was just where the sound chose to appear. After that, it happened irregularly, never predictable, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes nights in a row, always when I was alone, always when things were quiet enough that I could hear myself think. And the sound was never louder than it needed to be, just enough to make sure I noticed, just enough to make sure I listened. I stopped owning radios, threw them out, avoided places where they might be on, but it didn't matter because the sound adapted. It came through speakers, through old intercoms in parking garages, through a baby monitor in my sister's house when I was watching it for her. Always static first, always that sense of something aligning itself to me. And I never heard words again, not clearly, but I began to feel patterns in the noise. Pauses that came when I moved, shifts when I looked toward the source, like it was paying attention, learning how I reacted. And the worst part was how normal everything else stayed, how people around me never noticed, how I would ask if they heard anything and they would shake their heads, annoyed or concerned in that distant way people get when they think you're overreacting. So I stopped asking, stopped sharing it at all, because saying it out loud made it feel less real, like it might vanish if I didn't acknowledge it. But it didn't. It followed me through jobs, through apartments, through relationships that failed because I was always tired, always distracted, always listening. And sometimes late at night, when the sound settled into a steady rhythm, I would feel an overwhelming sense of being cataloged, like my habits, my movements, my silences were being noted somewhere I couldn't see. And I tried everything practical, had wiring checked, had neighbors questioned, even went to a doctor who suggested stress, anxiety, lack of sleep, and I nodded and agreed because those were explanations that didn't require me to accept the alternative. But the alternative crept in anyway, quietly, patiently. One night, I woke up to the sound without any device nearby, no speaker, no electronics on at all, just the room and the dark, and that familiar hiss coming from everywhere at once, like the air itself had learned how to transmit. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, afraid to move, because moving seemed to encourage it. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. It wasn't trying to scare me. It wasn't aggressive or angry. It was persistent, like a system running in the background, and I was part of its process now, something it checked in on. And the realization didn't come with panic. It came with a dull acceptance that settled deep, because fear requires the belief that something might stop, and this never did. It just adjusted. Years have passed since then, and the sound still comes, less often now, but clearer in a way I can't explain. I've learned not to react, not to turn toward it, not to write my name down where it might appear, and as long as I follow those rules, it stays quiet, manageable. But sometimes, late at night, when everything else is still, I hear static where there shouldn't be any, and beneath it, that same slow breathing, and I know it's still there, still listening, still aware that I'm here. And I understand now that being alone was never the problem. It was thinking I ever was. I tried to build a life that left no room for quiet, convinced myself that noise was a kind of armor, so I slept with fans running, televisions murmuring in other rooms, podcasts playing through the night, anything to blur the edges where that sound liked to slip in. And for a while it worked well enough that I almost believed I had imagined the worst of it, that memory had sharpened something ordinary into a threat. But the absence felt temporary, like a courtesy, and I noticed how the sound always returned when routines changed, when I moved apartments again, when I started a new job with late hours, when I spent too long alone with my thoughts. It never arrived abruptly anymore. It eased in, a suggestion rather than an interruption. And I learned the signs before it happened, the way the room would feel slightly hollow, the way my ears would strain even before there was anything to hear. And sometimes the sound came with a new detail, a faint clicking beneath the static, irregular, like someone testing a switch, and I would sit very still, counting my breaths, telling myself that attention was a form of permission, that as long as I didn't respond, it couldn't escalate. And that belief became a rule I followed carefully. I never spoke to it, never acknowledged it out loud, never tried to record it, because something about it felt procedural, like it was waiting for compliance. And the first time I broke that rule was an accident, a reflex. I was half asleep on the couch when the static seeped in, softer than usual, and without thinking, I muttered for it to stop. Not loud, barely a whisper, and the sound cut instantly. The silence that followed was so complete it felt engineered, and my stomach dropped, because silence had never been its response before. And I sat there for hours afterward, heart racing, knowing I had done something wrong without understanding why. The next night the sound returned earlier than it ever had, clearer, denser, filling the room without a source, and beneath the static there was a structure now, a cadence that felt deliberate, and I understood then that it had been learning restraint, not absence, and that my voice had confirmed something, that I could hear it, and that I would respond if prompted correctly. After that, the rules changed. The sound no longer waited for isolation. It arrived even when others were nearby, subtle enough that only I noticed, threading itself through conversations, through traffic noise, through the hum of offices. And I became hyper-aware of how often people paused mid-sentence, how often rooms fell quiet at the wrong moments, and I started to suspect that the sound wasn't following me so much as aligning with me, syncing to whatever frequency I occupied. And that idea hollowed me out, because it meant distance didn't matter, time didn't matter. It wasn't tied to a place or an object, it was tied to awareness. And once I accepted that, something else became clear. It never appeared when I was deeply focused, when my attention was fully consumed, only when my mind was open enough to notice it, like it needed a gap to slip through. And that understanding brought a strange sense of control. I filled my life with tasks, with schedules, with constant low-level engagement, and the sound receded again, not gone, but quieter, like a machine idling. And months passed that way, manageable, until the night I had nothing left to distract myself. The power went out during a storm, sudden and total, leaving the apartment in darkness and silence so complete it felt exposed, and I sat there listening to rain hammer the windows, counting seconds between thunder, trying to stay grounded. And when the static came, it was immediate, full-bodied, surrounding me, not loud, but absolute. And for the first time since the relay station, I felt that same certainty, that whatever this was had been waiting specifically for this, for me to be stripped of noise and light and explanation. And I didn't panic, I didn't speak, I just listened. And in the static, there was no breathing this time, no clicking, just a steady presence, like a channel held open. And as I sat there, I became aware of another sensation, subtle but undeniable, the feeling of being positioned, like my awareness itself was being aligned with something else, something vast and indifferent. And the fear that rose then wasn't sharp, it was heavy, because I understood that nothing about this was personal. I wasn't chosen, I was compatible, and compatibility was enough. When the power came back, the sound vanished instantly, leaving behind a silence that felt artificial, and I knew that whatever threshold I had crossed couldn't be uncrossed. Since then, I've lived carefully, quietly, keeping my mind occupied, my surroundings predictable, avoiding long stretches of solitude. But age has a way of narrowing options, of slowing you down, and I've started to notice how often the sound slips through when I'm tired, how it lingers longer than it used to.
And sometimes in those moments just before sleep, when thoughts blur and attention loosens, I sense it waiting, not impatient, not urgent, just present. And I realize the most unsettling part isn't that it followed me or learned me or listened still. It's that it doesn't need to hurry, because eventually everyone runs out of noise. And when that happens, when the world finally goes quiet enough, it will already be there, tuned in, and I will have no way left to pretend I can't hear it.
I'm older now, and the quiet has changed. It isn't empty the way it used to be. It has weight. Time has a way of narrowing your world until sound becomes something you notice instead of something that happens around you. And I've learned that noticing is dangerous. The habits I built to protect myself have worn thin. Friends stopped calling. Work ended. Days blended together. There are long stretches now where nothing interrupts the hours, and in those stretches the static doesn't wait to be invited. It arrives the way dusk does, gradually, without ceremony, settling into the room so gently that I sometimes don't realize it's there until I've already been listening for a while. I don't look for a source anymore. I learned that lesson. There is nothing to unplug, nothing to turn off. The sound exists where my attention loosens, where thought slows just enough to leave a gap. It's softer than it used to be, but more precise, like it no longer needs volume to hold its place. Some nights it feels almost companionable, which is worse than fear ever was. Fear implies opposition. This feels like coexistence. I keep myself busy as long as I can, reorganizing drawers that don't need it, rereading the same pages of books without absorbing them, pacing rooms I know by heart. But eventually the body insists on rest, and when I sit, when I let myself stop, the static grows clearer, not louder, just more defined, as if the world has tuned itself correctly. I don't think of it as watching anymore. Watching suggests curiosity. This is closer to monitoring, the way systems check for continuity, for signal integrity. There are moments, usually late at night, when the sound settles into a steady presence and I feel an odd pressure behind my eyes. Not pain, just alignment, like something unseen has found the exact position where reception is strongest. I don't panic. Panic requires urgency, and nothing about this feels rushed. It has always been patient. I think back often to that first night, to how ordinary everything was before the radio turned on, how I believed isolation meant safety, how I mistook silence for absence. What I understand now is that silence is a condition, not a barrier. It clears space. Over the years, I've tried to trace a pattern, to understand why this happens to some people and not others, but every explanation collapses under its own weight. It doesn't feel selective, it feels opportunistic. Awareness is enough. Being still is enough. Sometimes I wonder how many people brushed it off as stress or imagination, how many drowned it out with noise until age or circumstance stripped those defenses away. How many are hearing it right now and choosing not to acknowledge it, believing that refusal is the same as immunity? I used to think survival meant escape, but survival is just continuation, and continuation is something this presence understands very well. Lately, the static lingers even during the day, faint but unmistakable, threading itself through the ordinary sounds of life, through running water, through wind against windows, through my own breathing. It no longer retreats completely. It doesn't need to. I've noticed that when I try to focus too hard on it, it dulls, as if discouraging scrutiny. But when I let my mind drift, when thoughts soften and edges blur, it sharpens again, comfortable, assured. There are nights when sleep comes in fragments, and in the spaces between waking and dreaming, the sound feels closest. Not invasive, just present, like a line held open. In those moments, I understand something that took years to settle into words.
This isn't an intrusion, it's a connection that doesn't require consent, only availability. And availability is inevitable. Bodies weaken, minds slow, noise fades. Eventually, everyone reaches a point where silence isn't chosen, but imposed. I don't think there will be a final escalation, no revelation, no explanation. When the end comes for me, I doubt there will be any change at all. The static won't surge or disappear. It will simply lose one more place to surface, one more frequency to occupy. And somewhere else, in another quiet room, someone will pause and listen and think they are alone, and the sound will already be there, steady and patient, waiting for them.